This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 158 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about how to create a self-paced classroom. The phrase reinventing education gets thrown around a lot, and I heard it quite a bit when the pandemic hit. First, we all retreated into our homes, school went virtual, and for a while, everyone kind of panicked. Soon, though, voices started to emerge, and they said things like, hey, wait, maybe this is our chance. Maybe this is the kick in the pants we need to actually change education, to make it more student-centered, more authentic, more relevant. We literally can't conduct business as usual, so let's try something different. As of now, in November of 2020, I'm not too sure that reinvention has happened. I think most educators have been too overwhelmed by everything else that's gone down this year to actually do it. I also think we're still not totally clear what it is. Is it more project-based inquiry learning, more work driven by social justice, more collaboration, less testing? Yes to all of that. But who actually has their teaching act together enough under these conditions to implement any of it well? I have seen one bright light, though. One group that has figured out a piece of this puzzle with a model that solves one of the problems educators have been wrestling with literally for generations: honest-to-goodness differentiation, where each student is met where they are, is given an appropriate level of challenge, and grows at a steady pace throughout the school year. That group is the Modern Classrooms Project, an organization launched in 2018 to help teachers create self-paced classrooms. They teach a model that's fantastic, not just for classrooms under normal circumstances, but also for remote and hybrid teaching, when whole class in-person synchronous instruction is a near impossibility. My guest today is Kareem Farah, Modern Classroom's Executive Director. Kareem was on the podcast in April of this year on episode 144, and we talked about how to make a great screencast video. At the time, we knew teachers were scrambling to convert their in-person lessons into something that could be consumed virtually, so that seemed to fill the most pressing need. Today, we're pulling back and focusing on the bigger picture: how to set up and run a self-paced classroom. We talk about the many benefits of self-paced learning, the instructional shifts teachers need to make, handling tricky factors like district pacing guides and grading, and how to keep students motivated. Kareem has written a blog post over on Cult of Pedagogy that covers this same material in writing. So if you start to feel yourself wanting to take notes, just know that you can go over to the website, click on podcast, choose episode 158, and you'll find all the key points from today's conversation right there. And if you're interested in checking out Modern Classroom's free course on self-paced learning, go to cultofpedagogy.com/modern, and you'll be bounced right over there. I also feel obliged to mention that the idea of the self-paced classroom is not a new one, not even on this podcast. 5 years ago, on episode 30, I talked with a math teacher named Natalie McCutcheon, who had devised a system very much like the one we're going to talk about today. I was pretty blown away by her framework back then. And in the meantime, I'm sure others have also come up with similar methods. What Modern Classrooms has done that's unique is fine-tune the general idea of self-paced learning and built a course and a community to help teachers implement it in their own classrooms. Before I play the interview, I want to thank Wipebook for sponsoring this episode. Are flip charts part of your teacher toolkit? That is great. But conventional flip charts have two problems. One, they're awfully expensive, and two, they're not eco-friendly. One use and that's it. A cost-effective alternative that my team recently tried is called the Wipebook flip chart. It's a marriage between a conventional flip chart and a whiteboard. Each flip chart comes with 20 reusable surfaces, 10 double-sided sheets. One side is plain and the other is a graph pattern, perfect for math. Each sheet is 2 feet by 3 feet, and the pages are light and flexible so you can roll them up and bring them with you wherever needed. The flip chart also integrates with the free Wipebook Scan app, which allows you to quickly scan your work, save it digitally to the cloud, then reuse your flip chart as many times as you like. So if you're tired of wasting paper and money and want to give a Wipebook flip chart a try, check out wipebook.com/cultofpedagogy for up to 30% off. That's wipebook.com/cultofpedagogy. And if your board or district has used the product already and you want to order in bulk, use this link instead for even more discounts. Wipebook.com/cultofpedagogybulk. And that will get you up to 40% off. Support for this episode also comes from ListenWise, an award-winning online listening curriculum. ListenWise brings NPR podcast lessons into your classroom for grades 2 through 12. Teach listening skills while building content knowledge using engaging and relevant nonfiction podcasts. ListenWise is great for addressing the listening and speaking standards on your ELA state assessments, like the Smarter Balance test. And with ListenWise Premium, you get built-in literacy supports, automatically scored listening comprehension quizzes, and interactive transcripts so students can read along as they listen. Research shows that better listeners are better learners. Sign up for a 30-day free trial at listenwise.com/cultofpedagogy. Now, here's my interview with Kareem Farah about self-paced classrooms. Kareem, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how are you, Jennifer?
I should say welcome back, actually, because this is now your second time.
It's a joy to be back. As I told you the first time, you have my favorite education podcast out there. To be a guest once was thrilling. Twice is amazing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can still remember sitting at my computer, 6-7 months ago, whatever, when I first sort of discovered what you were doing. And I was like, oh my gosh, this guy has got what so many people need. Like, we need to send just people in droves over to your platform so they can learn from you. So it's a good synergy that we have here.
It sure is. It sure is. It's been wonderful.
So we are going to talk today about, you were on before to talk about making good screencast videos. What we're going to talk about today is self-paced learning. And so before we get into that, just tell us a little bit about you run something called the Modern Classrooms Project. Tell me what that is.
Sure. I'll give a little bit of background on myself just because that naturally will lead to what the Modern Classrooms Project is. So I was an educator for years. I was teaching in high-need environments, very diverse learning levels. And I was just generally frustrated as an educator. I'm sure many listeners know what that's like to be a frustrated educator. And I was seeking to reinvent my classroom to meet my students' needs better. And in particular, I was really frustrated with the reality that I was serving an incredibly diverse set of learning levels, but all I knew how to do was teach traditionally. Lecture, fixed pacing, and it just wasn't differentiated enough. So my co-founder and I started building instructional videos to replace our lectures. We let kids work at their own pace within each unit of study, started grading them on mastery. And we did that while still following traditional school and district expectations. We weren't at some super innovative school district. We were still using quarter grading principles and A through F grading principles and summative assessments and pacing calendars. So we found a way to kind of innovate within those constraints. Folks really started to get interested about our blended self-paced mastery-based approach. I won a couple awards in DC for it. Edutopia picked it up and made a brief video. And we basically found out, kind of like you said at the beginning, folks have a real appetite for innovative instructional models that are digestible, that are truly hands-on, that educators can dig deep into, and that can work in your traditional school frameworks. We found out there was real demand, so we founded the nonprofit, the Modern Classrooms Project, and our sole goal is to train educators on our blended self-paced mastery-based model. And we run a free course. We have about 20,000 educators in there right now, and a virtual mentorship program, which is where we provide comprehensive support to educators through individual subscriptions as well as a ton of school and district contracts.
Right. Okay. And I'm going to mention this again at the end of our conversation, but for people that want to check that out right now, they should just go to cultofpedagogy.com/modern. And from there, that's going to bounce you right over to the Modern Classrooms Project because it's an evolving platform, really. And so if you're listening to this in 2022, that'll send you to their main site and show you what they're offering. But from what Kareem and I have been talking about, it sounds like they're probably always going to have something that is free that can teach you sort of the basics, and then a fee-based program that can give you much more handholding and mentorship to really, really help you dig deep on how to run this type of a program in your own school.
That's right. And there will always absolutely be a free course, and we'll have all of our materials. I can promise you that.
Cool. Okay, so let's just start making sure that everybody understands what self-paced learning is. And so tell us what it is and why you believe it's better than what we're typically doing in traditional school settings.
Sure. I mean, self-paced, a lot of people, I think, get too lost in some of these terminologies and like
Yeah.
get stuck on thinking that self-paced learning means kids are just learning freely at their own pace in
Mm.
perpetuity. Self-paced learning just fundamentally means that you're giving kids a variable amounts of pace to let them master skills. And you could have a self-paced single period of a class, you could have a self-paced unit, you could have a self-paced year, you can have an entirely self-paced like educational journey. But the overarching idea is you're giving kids the opportunity to craft their own amount of time they need to master skills based on what they already know and whether or not they've demonstrated mastery. So really just that fundamental idea of giving kids variable pacing, letting them spend enough time if they need it on a skill, or moving forward if they've already shown mastery. All of us know generally what self-paced learning is because we've seen little kids, right? Little kids just self-pace all the time. They learn how to walk and talk and all that kind of stuff at their own pace.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reason it's critical is kind of multifaceted. So first and foremost, what I saw when I was an educator is so many kids coming into my class with zero confidence in their ability to be a student.
Yeah.
And it was because they had gone from classroom to classroom, from skill to skill. Having tried it, they had memories of like experiencing the skill, digging into the skill, but they didn't actually have real memories of mastering skills. And they
Mm-hmm.
became incredibly used to being rushed through content and then ultimately getting close to mastery or being somewhere on their journey to mastery and then being told they just had to move on. So
Yeah.
over time, right, when you don't let kids control their own pace to achieve mastery, you actually erode at their own confidence. They no longer believe in their own capacity to be a learner. And when that happens repeatedly, year after year, in some content areas and all content areas, they start to truly question whether they belong in classrooms. And that's really, really dangerous. So the first reason I deeply believe in self-pacing is because it's one of the best ways to build student self-confidence. You
Mm-hmm.
actually give a kid the opportunity to go from the beginning of learning a skill to actually showing mastery. Even if they only do 3 out of 5 skills in a unit or 5 out of 10 skills, at least they have shown themselves and shown their educator that they can actually master a novel skill. And for some kids, they really can't remember the last time that actually happened, and it's
Mm.
jarring.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me uncomfortable. And as a high school math teacher formerly, I mean, we train educators K through 12 across content areas, but you see this all the time in high school math. I mean, kids just walking into high school math classes being like, "I hate math. I'm terrible at
Yeah.
math." Right?
Yeah.
That's just like the assumption they make.
Right.
So the confidence piece is key. The other one is differentiation. I mean, ultimately, you just can't really differentiate that much if you don't use some level of variable pacing.
Yeah.
I always say it's the most overused and underexecuted term in education. Like you can't
Mm-hmm.
find a hallway, a school building, a conference where people aren't talking differentiation. But
Mm-hmm.
very rarely are we seeing it actually come to life where kids are truly getting differentiated supports in a
Yeah.
comprehensive way.
I think most teachers would pretty much agree that they want to differentiate, but they don't really know how to do it. They might know little ways of doing it, but I would guess that a lot of teachers just don't feel that confident in their ability to differentiate consistently.
Yeah. And, ultimately, when I taught traditionally for the first 3 years I was in the classroom, like I would just hear that term. And frankly, it would make me mad at a certain point because I was like, so
Mm,
am I just crossing off problems? Like, is that what's happening here? And
yeah.
then finally, when I started using self pacing, I was like, wait a minute. This is what differentiation means. Like, I am
Yeah.
legitimately giving this child double the time and potentially double the support than the person sitting right next to them. And that was
Mm-hmm.
super powerful. Now,
Yeah.
arguably, the hidden power of self-pacing to me, but so important, is I taught in environments where my kids were exposed to a ton of trauma. And when a
Mm-hmm.
kid would walk into my classroom, I taught traditionally, and I would see them in pain. And my gut reaction was to be like, they're in pain, but like they got to sit down because we got to do now. And then I'm going to lecture and then I'm going to tell them what to do. And they have to take
Mm,
notes. Like I always felt this really terrible tug and pull while I was like, I would love to be able to support this kid better in ways that are much more important than adding fractions today or factoring a quadratic. but
Mm.
that's my job. So I got to keep doing that. So when you
Yeah.
create a self-paced environment, right, that kid can walk into your class experiencing trauma and you can just go meet their needs, go talk to them, tell them to take a deep breath and not
Mm-hmm.
disrupt the larger learning environment, because
Mm-hmm.
kids aren't coming in there to like sit in rows and
Yeah.
listen to you talk. And that
Yeah,
one
you
is
don't have to
huge.
get on stage. So, when a person has to perform, they can't do anything else. So if you take that piece away, then you're more available to the kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's also, people always talk about like flexible seating in those relaxed classroom environments, but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not that relaxed if every kid has this walk in and like pick up where you left off and every minute of the day is super structured. So the self-pacing also creates an environment where kids understand they can ease in, but then understand the ramifications if you're procrastinating and going too slow, and see the real consequences of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other one, is self-regulation. Like, I always got so frustrated with this reality that classrooms and school buildings just didn't look like the real world. And ultimately, if my students had every element of their day micromanaged in K-12 education, but then would leave
Mm.
and go to college and go to class 15% of their day and have all these temptations like parties and all these things in a college, or they'd go to the workforce and get these long-term projects that they're expected to execute on and
Mm.
not really going to be, guided all that much, and they felt so unprepared. My seniors who would graduate would be like, why didn't anyone tell me that this was like what the real world looked like versus what I was dealing with in school, where every single minute of my day was structured? So ultimately, we can ignore that reality and have kids get blindsided when they leave our school buildings, or actually build and strengthen their ability to be self-regulated learners, which to me is arguably the most important skill we could teach kids in K-12 education, is to be a self-aware, self-directed learner that can handle novel situations, set their own goals, build out their own calendars and schedules. And I think that's so incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking about like mission statements that I see on schools and like about being lifelong learners and all of those things. And yeah, if there's no structure put in place to allow them to do that for themselves, then how do you ever, create that in them?
Exactly, right? I
Yeah.
mean, ultimately, it's kind of like that differentiation idea with self-pacing, where we can talk the talk, but if we don't create the conditions to actually differentiate, to actually build self-regulation, it's sort
Yeah.
of like a plug and play approach. Like, I'm going to
Mhm.
spend 10 minutes today talking with my kids about self-regulation. That's not what builds
Yeah.
self-regulation.
Yeah.
That's just like a cute idea we shared with our kids, but we're not
Right.
reinforcing day to day.
Yeah. Yeah, they need practice at it.
Yeah, right. I mean, you need repetition. And then
Yeah.
ultimately, the last reason is you just can't grade kids on mastery without self-pacing. I mean, we can talk mastery-based grading all day long. You can buy every platform that exists for mastery-based grading. But if every kid has to transition to the next lesson the next day, then you're ignoring the kids who haven't mastered those skills and pushing them forward inevitably if you're using a
Mm.
fixed pace approach. So
Mhm.
ultimately, if you want to achieve mastery-based grading in some way, shape, or form, flexible pacing and self-pacing have to be introduced into your frameworks.
All right. Well, I am definitely sold on this. I was sold on it a while ago, but hopefully we've sold some more people on it. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit into the nuts and bolts of how to actually do this. But the first thing that you recommend is that that teachers really have to let go of the idea of whole group instruction. So, talk to me about why that's necessary and what teachers should be doing instead to actually deliver that content to students.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, and when I always reference whole group instruction, I'm talking about that like lecture direct instruction, delivering
Mhm.
information to kids, they take notes. I always caution this to everyone in the world who's learning about the Modern Classrooms Project or our model. We do not replace discussions, labs, Paideia seminars, fishbowl discussions. We're talking about those times where the only way a kid learns lesson 3 is by listening to you explain
Yeah.
what is in lesson 3.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's just really restrictive for a multitude of reasons. A, it requires kids to be on the exact same lesson at the exact same time. B,
Mhm.
it requires you as the educator to manage that experience, which means you're not free to actually have small group instruction, differentiate to students' needs, hold some kids back because they haven't shown mastery and push the other kids forward, grave live and respond to that data. So
Mhm.
those lectures just ultimately are kind of like the elephant in the room. They're also just a fundamental bottleneck. It's like everything has to work through the lecture if you're still
Mm.
relying on the lecture. And
Mhm.
it's also just disengaging, right? We've talked about this plenty of times in education. It's not a mystery, right? Particularly long lectures are just not as engaging as when kids are doing the work, learning it in their own kind of student-centered way and then asking questions.
Yeah.
And the problem is when you're reliant on the lecture, you actually can't even entertain the ideas of self-pacing because it's sort of unimaginable, right? It's like, it's a cool idea. It sounds fun. It sounds interesting. I get why kids should work at different paces, but what do I do, right? What do I do next? How do I get past this idea that I'm still talking every single day and I hold the critical information? So, the most effective way that we train educators to get rid of the whole group direct instruction is to just build your own instructional videos. And, pre COVID-19 and pre
Mm.
sort of remote learning, that was kind of fringe. Like people were like, whoa, build your own instructional videos.
Yeah.
But ultimately now educators are constantly playing around with the new tech tools. Tech is landing in school districts and buildings at a pretty high rate. It's the perfect time to really get good at building your own instructional videos so that it's a natural part of your planning experience. By the time I had left the classroom, it was just automatic, right? When I planned a lesson, I create a slide deck, screencast it over it. That was my instructional video. And
Yeah.
I didn't have to deliver that at the front of the room.
And again, if people are listening and they want to, we go into a much deeper dive on high quality screencast videos in episode 144. So for anybody who's listening and wants to hear more on that specific topic, that would be where to go. So okay, if I'm teaching completely traditionally, let's imagine right now that this is pre-COVID, because I do think that a lot of teachers are sort of right now just forced to do this. But
Right.
let's forget about the situation we're in for a minute and imagine that I'm doing sort of daily lectures with my students. So if I wanted to start to try this, would I be sort of like looking at my next unit maybe and saying, okay, let me go ahead and record a couple, 7 or 8 screencast videos to replace the lectures that I was doing before.
Yeah.
So I've got the instruction piece in place now, the direct instruction piece. Then what happens next? What do they just put everything on Google Classroom and say, go ahead, have at it, guys, just work your way through? Or, how does a teacher actually manage the different pacing of students?
I'm so glad you brought this up because this is the most like underdeveloped element of what I've seen out there regarding self-paced learning.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just seems to be an idea without any structures and systems attached to it. And
Right.
what I always tell folks is there's a huge distinction between controlled chaos and complete chaos.
Yeah.
And if you just put a bunch of videos on your Google Classroom and say, learn kids, that's going to be complete chaos. The
Yeah.
way you achieve controlled chaos is by building in a variety of structures. So the first we always say is you self-pace in chunks. So what we say at the Modern Classrooms is never beyond one unit of study. In most cases, educators are doing shorter chunks than that, 1 week at a
Okay.
time, 3 weeks at a time, half unit at a time. So you've laid out a clear kind of outline of lessons with a
Mm-hmm.
beginning and end date and assessments and goals associated with it.
Okay.
And then from there, right, the next obvious question is I'm giving my kids 2 weeks to master these 6 lessons. Well, inevitably, you have to know that some kids aren't going to master all 6. So the
Right.
second step is classifying those lessons. Of those 6, which ones are must-dos? Like we need every kid to master these lessons to be competent in this unit. Which ones are the should-dos? We expect every kid to master these lessons if they're on grade level. And what are my extension lessons? If it's out of 6 lessons, maybe there's 1 extension, 2 should-dos, and 3 must-dos. You've laid them out cleanly. So now, as an educator, my job is to lay the deadlines out, put all the materials out, pivot when students need it, and also put kids on personalized pathways based on the lesson classification. So if one kid's falling real behind, you go up to them and say, hey, you're excused for lesson 3. That's a should do. Once you master lesson 2, go ahead and jump to lesson 4 to really make them feel like they can achieve the content and get through the unit on the deadline.
And you're completely transparent with students about these 3 different classes of lessons, correct? It's not like a secret or anything. The kids know which one is the must, the should, and the extension.
It actually depends on the educator and the environment. So
Okay.
I would say most teachers are pretty transparent, and some of them will actually use grades associated with it. So like the highest grade you can get if you only do
Mm-hmm.
the must do's is an 80% or a B or something
Got
like
it.
that. Now
Okay.
I taught, and one of my classes, I was teaching students at around a third grade math level that were sitting next to the valedictorians. It was this crazy
Mm,
sort of amalgamation of students. Some were taking this math class because they wanted to add another math course to their transcript, and other kids, this was like the final frontier to graduation. So there was
okay.
just no way for me to kind of structure my units such that every kid knew what was what and they would travel through it. So I actually
Yeah.
kept it hidden. When I knew that a kid was struggling but working hard, I knew which lessons I could tell them to jump, but I still wanted those students that, could be pushed really hard to expect that they had to master every single lesson in the unit. So
Okay.
ultimately, it's a teacher discretion question.
Hmm.
And I've seen it done very well in both.
Okay, that because that even before I had ever heard about this type of a model, I can remember just learning about sort of Carol Tomlinson and like tiered assignments and thinking, how do you keep the advanced students wanting to do? I know a lot of really smart kids who are like, if I can do the easy level and then have nothing left to do, I'm going to do that.
Right.
So,
And
so
that
I think it requires some, I don't know, mind games or something that you have to
and
play
that
with them.
and that's what I would say to my kids. And the beauty again of self-paced learning is you can have a lot of one-on-one discussions. So I had
Uh-huh.
some kids who would come up to me and be like, why is that kid over there only mastering 6 lessons? I got to do 10. And
Yeah.
I said, do you want me to hold you to lower expectations than you're capable of? Right?
Right.
Like this is what you should be doing. That student has unique circumstances that are making it difficult for them to master all 10 lessons. If
Uh-huh.
you ultimately really want to do this, go ahead, but you're setting lower expectations for yourself and not achieving what you can. That's a powerful conversation ultimately
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
enjoyed having. So I was passionate about that. The other thing I did by keeping them secret, and this was just my class, again, tons of teachers totally tell everyone with full transparency, is when I
Mhm.
did excuse a kid for a lesson, I would say to them, don't go sharing that I excused you for this lesson.
Mm.
Like we're having a trusting relationship. I can see you're working hard. I
Yeah.
think you've earn the fact that this is really your ability to succeed right now in this unit and you're dealing with extenuating circumstances. So I'm going to excuse you for lesson 4. But if you start running around and saying you got excused for lesson 4, then you're doing lesson 4. Like this is a relationship you and I are building, right? And it's another great lever for building strong relationships because that kid
Yeah.
now looks at me and says, "Oh, Mr. Fair has got my back. He understands when I'm working hard and he wants me to succeed, and he's creating the space for me to do that." So I think there is actually power in not telling kids, but there's also power in telling them and saying, you choose your pathway, right? And
Yeah.
you can, take the consequences if you choose. That's equally powerful as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm also thinking there just may be some necessary trial and error with this, maybe unit by unit as teachers start to get used to this and they figure out what works for them and their students.
Undoubtedly. I
Yeah.
mean, I tell this to folks all the time. If you're not making adjustments unit by unit, especially in the early stages, you're either
Mm,
a wizard or you're not doing it right because
yeah.
ultimately you have to tweak
Wizard.
it for you got to tweak it for your kids. They're
Yeah.
different. Your school environment's going to be different. They're going to take to it differently.
Yeah, I think that's also such an important mindset to have when you are trying something new. I've seen so many teachers and whole schools try to implement a new program or a new methodology and just throw their hands up after 6 days, this isn't working. And it's like if there's some research behind it and if has worked for other people, it just may be that you've got some growing pains to get through.
And I always tell folks, this is sort of a little bit off topic, but in the spirit of innovation, ultimately I think educators get super scared and the
Mm,
negative feedback is super salient. So whenever
yeah.
I train educators or when we train educators in the Modern Classrooms Project, I tell them the 10% rule. Expect 10% of students to hate it, 10% of colleagues to hate it, 10% of admin to hate it
Mm,
at least. Because
yeah.
then right? Don't freak out when one kid says, I hate what you've done, or when one
Yeah.
admin says, I hate this model, right? That shouldn't move you from innovating. It should just be, an asterisk and good
Mhm.
information. But if you're
Mhm.
reaching the bulk of students more effectively, that's super powerful.
Yes. And that's the thing is that's the question I often throw back to people when they say this isn't working is what we were doing before wasn't working great either. So it's not like the argument should be to go back to what we were doing before where a third of our kids weren't really learning anything at all and the other middle third was kind of hated everything we did. So,
Exactly.
anyway. Okay, so How do so what we've got is a I'm imagining maybe like a week. We've got these lessons. They're going to watch some videos, and they're going to have some tasks and assessments that they have to sort of get through in order to demonstrate mastery.
Yep.
And then so at and how are you keeping track of students' progress?
And this is so incredibly important. I mean, every educator who uses our model always talks about progress tracking. So we have an entire
Hmm.
section on our course about this. And there's
Okay.
really two approaches you can take: public trackers and individual trackers. And the overarching principle is the same. Every single kid, when they walk into your class, should know exactly where they're at, and you should know where they're at. Now, they
Hmm.
can have an individual tracker. Teachers love game boards. You can also create a checklist where
Hmm.
basically, as they travel through the unit, it can go as granular as watched video, took guided notes, then did
Mm.
assignment, then did mastery check, or as simple as lesson one, lesson two, lesson three, depending on how much you want to break it down. Probably depends on the age of your
Yeah.
students as well. That's an individual tracker, a game board style model. The public trackers we also love. So in my classroom, kids would walk in and there'd be a PowerPoint slide displayed, and it would just say where you're supposed to be at today. If you're on pace, you're on lesson three. That means you're
Hmm.
good to go for the end of unit assessment. You've been tackling the lessons at the pace that you need to. And then it would indicate where students are at in the unit. I'm on, Tim is on lesson three, Jessica's on lesson four. Some folks will get nervous about names being publicly displayed. It's not grades or anything like that. So you can
Yeah.
always use nicknames. You can always use
Hmm.
like numbers and codes, or you can
Hmm.
just stick with just using that guideline. Like every kid should know that if they're on lessons 1 through 2 right now, they're behind. If they're on lesson 3, they're on pace. And if they're on lessons 4 through 6, they're on the accelerated pathway.
Aha. Okay. Almost like a, yeah, like a I'm picturing for some reason like a thermometer. Like if you're here, yeah, okay. So that students can compare that general information to their own personal trackers.
And it's guiding your discussions with kids. I always talk
Okay.
about this with educators. So much of my time with students in class when I did this model was not actually about content, but about navigating self-regulated learning and
Mm.
self-pacing. So I'm going up to a student and saying, "What lesson are you on?" They're saying they're on lesson 3. I say, "The pacing tracker says you're supposed to be on lesson 5." They say,
Mm.
"Yeah." I say, "So what's your plan? Like, what are we doing
Mm.
about this? Because you're on
Mhm.
lesson 3, you're supposed to be on 5, and you have a unit assessment after 7." And that
Yeah.
leads to these great conversations where kids are forced to say, "Oh, I got to take control of the situation because this is kind of like a train that's coming at me, and I got to make a decision. I got to come to an office hours. I got to do some extra work at home to find my
Mm.
way to stay on pace." And those are really powerful discussions, but they're meaningless if you don't have a progress tracking system, because you'd be surprised at how often kids just expect to kind of walk into a class and learning just sort of happens to them and they leave.
Mhm.
Right? That's what our education system has done to most
Yeah.
kids. I just show
Yeah.
up to fourth period and learning happens, and then I leave, and then I show up again to fourth period the next day. This
Yeah.
really makes them reflect on that. And one other structure I always tell folks about with this, it's kind of connected to motivation, is actually having kids do just a few minutes of goal setting every class. So when they walk
Mm.
in, the first thing they do is on like a template. Usually this was our do nows. What lesson are you on? What lesson should you be on? What are your next steps for the day? What are your next steps for
Mhm.
the week?
Mhm. I love that. That's a
Right?
great idea just to get their head in the right place. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I do it every morning myself, right? But I don't think I ever did
Yeah.
it as a student. I wish I did.
Yeah, right, and that's just a great habit to get them into for everything else in their lives to be just taking a minute to make a little plan.
That's right.
So the public trackers also have another benefit in terms of grouping students. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways you can do it. In our free course, we have a few options. So you have like an actual group tracker, which plenty of teachers use. So it'll be like lesson
Mhm.
4, and then all the students who are working on lesson 4, and and sometimes it'll also say lesson 4, and like these students sit at this table, or you can use heterogeneous grouping.
Mhm.
Ultimately though, my favorite thing was the cultivation of organic collaboration. So if I'm a
Mhm.
student and I'm stuck on lesson 3, and I come straight to my teacher and I say, "Hey, can you help me with lesson 3?" The first thing I, as a teacher, say is, "Have you asked some of the other kids who are on lesson 4?" You have
Mm.
actual data telling you who's mastered the lesson you're on. So it's no longer a question of, "Oh, go work with Jessica because I told you to." It's now actually, "Go work with Jessica because she's mastered the skill you're struggling with, and she actually can help you right now, and there's evidence of that." And then
Yeah.
Jessica, I also have evidence. If Jessica's like, "I can't help you," I'm like, "Excuse me? I actually just worked with you. You've mastered lesson 3. You certainly can help." So it's a really powerful way to cultivate organic collaboration in a data-driven way and put that in the hands of the students, which frankly, I think is how the workplace works, right? We seek out the other colleagues of ours before we go to our
Mm-hmm.
boss that
Mm-hmm.
actually know what we don't know and seek that help out. And it creates a world where students can do the same thing at any grade level.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that naturally transitions us into my next question. And I think this is another misconception that people have about self paced learning is that students are all working on their own, no one's interacting with each other. So, how do you build in collaboration in a self paced environment?
Yeah. So one of the ways is those pacing trackers, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
cultivating that organic collaboration, using the data to drive pairings. One really cool thing that folks will do is they'll list out lesson all stars as you move through a unit. So
Uh
if
huh.
most kids are done with lesson two, pick the 2 or 3 kids that crushed it, put on the board
Yeah.
lesson all stars, and list their names. So now we know like those are your 3-point people for lesson two. But
Nice.
ultimately, what I always tell folks is it's sort of an odd concept that we think that the only way that we can have discussions is if we've all mastered the same number of skills, right? Like
Mm.
that's sort of been created by our education system. It's not actually factual. Obviously, we all have families and gatherings and we have discussions about topics across a broad variety of issues. And we don't assume that everyone's mastered or read the exact same articles, but we can still talk about math and English and history and science. And we can plan discussion topics and activities that aren't reliant on every kid having mastered every single skill up to that point. Now, we do this
Right.
anyways, by the way, because most of our kids are diverse learners. So, what I tell folks all the time is you can hold a whole group discussion whenever you want. I actually did it at the opening of every class period for a lot of units. I would start out by saying, hey, here are the common misconceptions I'm seeing. Let's talk about them. Or I'd pick an idea in math in a spiraled way, and I'd say, today we're going to talk about this skill. Our history teacher that I started working with early on, she would have discussion bags, and every class would start. First 10 minutes, she'd drop a discussion bag on each table. It had discussion topics related to the unit. They would talk it through. They would have a sort of system for that, and then as soon as that's done, they'd release to self-pacing. So there's
Mm-hmm.
nothing about the model that says that you can't literally hold whole group discussions at activities. What we say is don't just stand at the front of the room and deliver new information in a direct instruction way.
Got it.
And then the other thing I always say is, you do really want to think about the learning space. You do not have to have kids pointing at the front of the room, waiting for you to lecture and talk at them. So design that learning space so it's incredibly collaborative. Never have I seen a modern classroom that isn't tables and groups. That's
Mm-hmm.
just the way it goes because
Mm-hmm.
they're organically going to start working with each other, especially when you hold strong as the educator and say, I'm not going to just help you every time you ask. Find your peers who have mastered these skills. Certainly, at some times I would, but I'm focused on actually grading your mastery checks and assignments and holding small group and individualized instruction at that point, after you've gotten your feet wet with the content.
Yeah. So, you've got kids working at different paces. And so, how do you, we sort of touched on this a little bit with the advanced kids, but just in general, how do you keep kids motivated in this kind of environment?
Yeah, I mean, so ultimately, like I tell every teacher that tries this model, like be ready for some kids that struggle with motivation, particularly
Mhm.
because they have gotten used to just walking into classrooms,
Mm,
compliantly following along, maybe getting an okay grade because of completion efforts and just like kind of osmosis of being in the room. So then
yeah.
suddenly when you're like, no, you actually have to like open up a computer and watch your own instructional video, take notes, be the driver of your own learning. That's really hard because they haven't been put in a situation where they're in the driver's seat and they have to be a self-regulated learner. So there's a couple ways we frame it. The first group of strategies we have are relationship-based strategies. And when we say relationship-based strategies, we're basically just telling educators, use the benefit of you not being on stage every day to actually go and figure out what gets kids going in an individual way. So, for example, the first unit every year of school, I made it a point every class period, one on one conversation for just a couple seconds with every kid. I would walk
Mm,
around the room. It took me about 5 to 7 minutes, but the content, was first unit, kids were easing in. And I would just go talk to the kid, like, what's getting you going? What's causing you stressors? Build a relationship with each individual kid that makes them feel like you're paying attention to them. You know
yeah.
exactly what they're doing each day, and you know what gets them going and what bothers them. Once you do that, then you really want to focus on that goal setting. Like, how can I get kids to goal set daily? How can I use do nows where kids indicate to me how they're feeling each day, what they want to accomplish each day, and what their goals are for the remainder of the week? And then having that back and forth. And we always talk about the modern classroom project follow through. Like, do not just have a conversation with a kid and forget what you talked about. Like, jot it down, know what you talked about, think about those goals, bring it back to them when they're
Mm.
struggling. Because
Mm-hmm.
without that follow through, kids know that this is just like a potentially just kind of like going through the motions relationship activity, right? Kids have done a million of those, but you want
Yeah.
them to feel like you're actually watching them day in, day out and invested in their capacity to grow as a learner. So we call those relationship based strategies, and it's really contingent on those one on one discussions and having them as much as possible. The
Mm-hmm.
second world is just incentive based. So, the easiest one, and I don't love being super obsessed with grades, but, what we call the soft zero strategy. So if
Mm.
you're supposed to be at lesson 6 today and you're on lesson 4, well, in the grade book, you got a 0 for lessons 5 and 6. It's a
Mm.
soft 0, so you can see
Mm.
the impact on your grade. But as soon as you master that skill, you're getting full credit. Like, there's no damage done to your grade. But
Mm-hmm.
what that does is it teaches kids, like, here's the consequences of procrastination. Like, you actually have a 66% instead of 100%, all because you procrastinated, right? And that's a big difference because you've only gotten through 2/3 of the lessons.
Yeah.
Other teachers will use structures like, if you only master the must dos, you can only get an 80%. If you do the aspire to dos, you get some sort of incentive. So those are kind of incentive based strategies. They're not the best ones. Relationship are always the best, but we're educators. We know that you have to create some systems and structures in place for kids to understand the consequences of not using their time
Yeah.
effectively.
Yeah. And I'm guessing the better relationship you have and the more buy-in you've gotten from them in the value. Like, I'm listening to this whole model and I'm thinking about going to CrossFit every day, and everybody is kind of working on different skills all the time. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but
Yep.
you've got people coming in brand new, 300 pounds, like really, really unable to do a lot of stuff. And to them, just doing one push up on their knees is a huge accomplishment and everybody cheers them on. Meanwhile, somebody else is, doing strict pull-ups on gymnastics rings, and everybody respects that we're all working at different things at a different time. No one's failing.
That's right. And
Yeah.
I remember one of the coolest ways to use incentive-based strategies was actually around cell phone use. Now, every
Mm.
school and district has a different cell phone policy, but and I remember going into a teacher's classroom and they basically said, if you're on pace, you can have your phone.
Ah, okay.
You've
Okay.
proven to me that you can manage your pace effectively, which means that phone is not actually detracting from your capacity to execute the tasks in front of you. It's frankly no
Yeah,
different than me. Like, I've gone through phases where I'm like, I got to leave my phone in the bedroom because if I'm near
exactly.
it, like, I'm donezo. So, it's a
Yeah,
similar model, right? But there's a lot of levers there to show kids, like, what are the things that are detracting from you being able to stay in pace, be a self-regulated learner, and how can we create on-ramps for you to get there? And another teacher actually had a bucket and just told kids, like, I'm not going to take your phone away, but I strongly encourage you to put your phone away if you're
yeah,
behind. And you would see kids on their own be like, man, I'm 3 lessons behind. Like, I got to give you my phone. Like, this
yeah,
thing is in
yeah.
my way. And it was cool to empower kids to do that.
That's great. I would think too that this is another piece of knowing your students too, because I would hate to think that there's a student out there who legitimately just needs more time than other students to understand a concept and is then being penalized for taking too long.
And that's
Because then that
that
kind of goes against the whole idea of self-paced learning.
and that's the art of those classifications. Like,
Ugh.
I would watch those like a hawk. And
Okay.
ultimately, like, even something as tiny as, like, a lot of educators will use behavior trackers. Just
Yeah.
like, even just looking at your roster every day and then, like, just using some color coding system to be like, that kid put in full effort today, that kid put
Mm.
in full effort. So you're noticing which kids are putting in full effort. So if they're falling behind, you got to do something to make sure that they are still on pace. That means
Yeah.
adding another must do lesson and a should do lesson, or creating a structure for them to be excused, maybe reducing the amount of work on a lesson, maybe saying, to get mastery you just need to explain your thinking this time as opposed to writing this
Mm.
piece, right? But
Mhm.
always tracking who are the kids that are putting in full effort, because ultimately they should never feel like they're behind, right? That's
Yeah.
just doesn't make any sense. They constantly feel like they're behind in education and they constantly don't feel like they're understanding the content. But you have the power with personalization to ensure that that kid feels like they're successful with lesson classifications and other differentiation strategies. And it's really important to just track who's putting in full effort. And it'll pay off big time. And my kids really appreciate it in my class.
Yeah. So we have basically sort of just scratched the surface. Feel like this has been like a nice little mini course for people that are starting to really want to get into this. But if they want to get more, they should go to cultofpedagogy.com/modern. That is going to bounce them straight over to your site where they can access the free course, the mentorship. I've got a question too, and I've never looked deeply into this, but does your mentorship program also include some sort of like an online community where they can talk to each other?
Lovely question. So
Yeah.
like the free course, first of all, has that online community. So
Oh,
basically, when
great.
you enroll in the free course, like it'll tell you all these different places to access. You get a weekly email from our staff that gives you all these
Mm,
updates. It tells you about all the scholarship opportunities. We're actually building a waiting list as we speak of folks who want to be in the virtual mentorship program. And then we're going on a fundraising campaign to basically get as many educators off the waiting list and into our virtual mentorship program as possible. So you'll enter
fantastic.
into a community. One of the best communities is our Facebook group. There's 2,500 educators in there. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
incredibly lively. It's largely free course users. For the folks that join the virtual mentorship program, once they graduate, and actually right when they join, they get entered into what we call our MCP Innovative Educator Portal. So we have a Slack channel that you get entered into that you can ask
Mm,
questions and have staff as well as colleagues reply to. You have office hours that you have access to that are held by our educators and our staff members. And then you have these opportunities that'll be presented to you. So ultimately, we're actually going to be moving into a credentialing process. So if you're doing the model and can demonstrate that you're doing it, you're a distinguished modern classrooms educator. If
mm,
you're doing it really well and want to potentially become a mentor, you can apply to become a mentor, and then you mentor other teachers and get paid to mentor other teachers. And that's the next phase. And then the final phase will be a master facilitator where you're actually leading some of these synchronous sessions and office hours. So, I mean, ultimately, there's a lot of different communities. The virtual mentorship program gives you access to all of them, and the free
mm-hmm.
course gives you access to most of them. So, I encourage educators, start in the free course. And if you're looking for more support, definitely dig into the virtual mentorship program. And, what I always tell folks is the bulk of educators that are coming into our virtual mentorship program are coming through just by requesting funding from their school or district, right? Can you cover this PD experience for me?
Yeah.
Or they're getting a crew of educators at their school or district or a cohort to come through the program. And it's always fun to do it with a few folks, right? Get 3 English teachers, at the 6th grade level, and you all do the virtual mentorship program
Yeah.
together. Yeah,
Oh, yeah. Way greater chance for success that way too, I think.
definitely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And also, just for full disclosure, I am an affiliate for your program, and I think it's necessary for me to say that that I do get a small cut of people that come through my link to your site. I'm not an affiliate for very many programs, only the ones that I really really strongly believe in, and I am a huge fan of what you're doing. So, um, let people know that. Thank you so much for coming on and exploring this topic with me.
Of course, Jennifer, it's always a joy. I love this podcast. I love talking through these ideas, and we love having you be an affiliate because it is the best endorsement we could possibly have for you to say that our work is cool and that teachers can actually derive benefit from it. No better person to say that.
For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode and to read Kareem's blog post, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 158. And again, to learn more about the free course and the mentorship program at the Modern Classrooms Project, just go to cultofpedagogy.com/modern. Thanks so much for listening and have a great day.